Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on FTP, FTPS, and SFTP. Which protocol should you use and when? Where our expert will help you understand the differences between essential protocols and show you how to determine which is the best for your goals. My name is Darian Miller, and I will be your host. Our presenter for today's presentation is Scott Messick. Scott is a lead solutions engineer with Fortra and is based in New Jersey. He has over 20 years of IT experience working in and managing IT teams in highly regulated industries. In this role, he works with and supports the largest Fortra customers and prospects across North America and South America. Welcome, Scott. And before I kick it over to Scott, please know that you can submit your questions through the questions bar at any time. And if time allows, we'll finish today's webinar with some Q&A. At the end of today's webinar, you will be prompted to complete a follow-up survey. This survey helps us to know which topics you would like to learn more about and will give us an opportunity to submit any questions you have after the webinar. If we're not able to answer your questions during today's webinar, then we'll follow up with you afterwards to answer your questions. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be sent out to you afterwards. All right, time to get started. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks a lot, Darian, and thanks for everyone today taking the time out of your day to watch this webinar, which, as Darren mentioned, we're going to be going over FTP, FTPS, as well as FTP. We're going to go into the little high-level overview of each protocol. We're going to look into some things that are common and some things that are different about them. We're also going to get into architecture concerns, as well as trying to kind of help you put together which protocol might make the most sense when you design your environment. So there's a lot of things that go into that. We're going to walk through a demo. I'm going to go through the console. I'm going to go through listeners. I'm going to go through resources connecting to outside FTP, FTPS, as well as SFTP servers. I'll go through logging. I'll show you some content scanning as well for inbound or outbound files as they're being transferred. And then we'll go through some questions and answers, and then we'll wrap the webinar up. So let's get right to it. Let's first start with FTP. Basically, or legacy FTP. It's been around for ages. Probably the most popular in the grand scheme of things. You'll hear most people talk about FTP, file transfer protocol, because it's been around kind of forever. A couple of things to consider. One, when it was first designed, there wasn't really any security, or there weren't too many security requirements. Internet connectivity before it was identified that files could be malicious, or therefore people connecting, uploading, or trying to sign in as a bad actor to adversely affect your FTP infrastructure or anything along those lines. Two separate data channels. Something else to consider is that also for FTPS, which we'll get into, is there are two separate channels, but typically usernames, passwords are sent unencrypted. So there's little security that can be supplied when using the FTP protocol itself. That's basically, in summary, that's pretty much what FTP is. I'll get into a little more details around why people are still using FTP, or why you may still have a requirement to use it. But let's go ahead and move on and talk about FTPS in a little detail now. Essentially, it's adding security to some extent. We'll talk about that a little bit. Still two separate channels. FTPS typically uses for explicit, as you can see here, could be port 21. Implicit could be port 990, but that's typically customizable. As you can see with FTPS, we're typically dealing with certificates. We'll go into certificates versus SSH or SSL, which is used by SFTP, but we talk about certificates and key management, key exchange, distribution of public certificates so that the the other party or your trading partner has the ability to connect to your infrastructure, or vice versa, if you need to be able to connect to an outside infrastructure using FTPS. Here you'll see the first implementation of kind of, to some extent, a multi-factor authentication, because now you use certificates as well as usernames and passwords. The user IDs and passwords can be sent unencrypted, can also be encrypted. There's typically a range of ports that are required. So from an infrastructure standpoint, it's a little more complex to configure because you have a small dynamic range of ports that you have to configure to allow FTPS. But as you can see here, you start to get into encryption, support for different encryption algorithms. As you can see, AES or DES. The certificates are used to basically verify the user's authenticity. So that's when we start to get into multi-factor authentication. The ports are customizable, but basically once the handshake occurs, then the data channel is used to transmit data. Like I said, you can encrypt the authentication process, or you can leave it unencrypted. It's kind of you got to have some flexibility. So as you can see here, as we move along, we move from FTP to FTPS. We're adding a layer of security. So now when we talk about SFTP, probably the most modern, also can control the port, can use port 990. You can customize that as well. I'll show you within our within Go Anywhere that's highly customizable. A lot of our customers change the ports so that connections from the outside can't try to randomly guess what ports maybe an SFTP connection can use. But essentially, a couple of differences. One, a single port is used for SFTP versus FTPS, which makes it a little easier to set up from an infrastructure standpoint. We start to get into SSH and SSL keys as opposed to certificates that FTPS requires. You have a couple of different encryption algorithms that can be supported. Again, you have stronger authentication, multi-factor authentication, because you can use the SSH keys in addition to the user ID and password. And like I mentioned, could be a single port when implementing SFTP. So that kind of allows for your infrastructure team. It's a little less from a configuration standpoint, a little easier to set up, and probably a little bit more secure because you're only allowing one port in as opposed to the dynamic port range as well when we talk about FTPS. So multiple port ranges required for FTPS. Some similarities and differences between the three protocols. They're all fairly commonly used. We get requests for support for all of them. Oftentimes legacy environments, legacy applications, trading partners, other companies that you're working with to transmit data, you essentially may have a requirement to support any of these or all of these. A lot of companies are trying to enforce more secure file transfer algorithms to use, for instance, FTPS or SFTP, but in some cases, your trading partners may not yet support them, or vice versa. And so in this case, you have no choice but to use FTP. That's important to consider because you don't want to lock yourself into a scenario where you don't support at all certain types of file transfer protocols. Maybe it's a security requirement or an audit requirement or something along those lines. But if you need to support these protocols to transact your business, then you kind of have to just do it as best as you can to put mitigating controls, maybe whitelisting only certain IP addresses or something along those lines to further harden the FTP sessions. As you can see, and I mentioned, FTP is it's not encrypted, so packets can be analyzed for usernames and passwords, and the data as well can be intercepted, as opposed to FTPS and SFTP, where we start to talk about leveraging encryption. One port for FTP and SFTP, whereas with FTPS you have two different port ranges, the dynamic port range of the control channel and the data channel. As far as the implementation is concerned, we talk about single ports for FTP, as I just mentioned, and SFTP. as opposed to ranges of ports for FTPS. So as I have said, it might be a little more complex to configure FTPS, but again, as an organization, when we talk about supporting your file transfer environment, you could wind up in a scenario where you may have to support bits and pieces of all of these file transfer protocols. So just kind of a summary that I've just went over. Little security for FTP can be considered when trading partners require it. You may have no choice from that standpoint. FTPS adds that second layer of security because now you can use certificates in addition to usernames and passwords. It's a little bit, so now we move to SFTP. Just quickly, I'll summarize that. A single port like FTP, so it could be a little easier to configure, and it is secure because we're using keys to manage the connections as well. So we'll also get into key management, which Go Anywhere can help you out with. And then as far as from a performance standpoint, it's been noted to some extent that FTPS is a little quicker. However, there has been some changes to the SFTP protocol to allow over the recent years to allow for more faster, efficient file transfers when you're dealing with large amounts of data. So this could be important if you are transferring large amounts of data, because it's been noted that FTPS is a little bit quicker than SFTP, but as I mentioned, SFTP is there's some changes that have occurred that Go Anywhere is working on introducing into a product that may increase file transfer speeds. And then we also have other solutions that could help you out with expediting file transfers as well, like for instance, File Catalyst. As far as the architecture is concerned, the basics are implementing using encryption. As you can see, SFTP and FTPS both support encryption, both support the encryption of usernames and passwords if configured, both supports key-based authentication, whereas FTPS only supports certificates. And then as far as the firewall's configuration is required, basically, as I have been mentioning, FTPS is a little more manual configuration because you have separate sets of ports that have to be configured, as opposed to SFTP, which is a single port, typically out of the box 990, but that can be customizable. So this kind of just goes through some of the architecture considerations when rolling out FTPS versus SFTP. Which protocol is best? This is a difficult question to answer because there's certain elements of this that fall on requirements provided by the business, requirements used by trading partners, and so you may have justifications to use a legacy file transfer protocol which doesn't offer much security like FTP, depending upon if some of your trading partners are using FTP. And so that's one thing to consider. As far as from a performance standpoint, FTPS might offer, as I've been mentioning, a little better performance. However, SFTP, there's been changes that have been made to allow for those transfers to be a little quicker, and there's some changes that are going to be upcoming that could furthermore increase file transfer efficiency when working with SFTP. From a security standpoint, both SFTP as well as FTPS are secure. SFTP, a little more overhead on the firewall, as I did mention. However, SFTP is single port range. A couple of examples where FTPS, might be a better choice. Like I had mentioned, transferring large files, certain types of data transfers, as you can see here, EBC, DIC, or ASCII. Or if your trading partner also, like with FTP, if they only support legacy file transfers, they could only support the transfer of certificates. And if this is the case, then we must use FTPS as opposed to SFTP, which SFTP supports keys, not certificates. So there's a couple of things to consider when you're trying to determine which protocol makes the most sense. up to you and what your requirements have to say about the architecture that you put when you're building out your infrastructure. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move to a live demo where I demonstrate some of the FTP, FTPS, SFTP settings, configurations. I'll go through resources, I'll go through listeners, I'll go through logging, file transfer, some of the logs in the file transfer, some project-based logging as well. So just sign into my lab environment and sign into my Go Anywhere infrastructure. So we'll start with resources. As most of you are probably aware, resources give you the ability to connect to external parties, use them within your workflows. And then the listeners, which is the second part I'll get into, that's people connecting into your environment. So you're essentially a client when we talk about resources. To begin with, we'll go through the FTPS servers. As you can see here, I have a test FTPS server, FTP server defined. I've just got my username and my password. I could send that through a proxy if I wanted to, more architecture considerations. If you don't want to publish the IP address to the outside world for your Go Anywhere infrastructure, you could hide that behind a proxy, and then all of the resource connections that are made will route through a proxy to the outside world. And you could also use your Go Anywhere gateway for that as well, which is fully supported. You can see I've just got my username and password. I've got some directory commands. I can customize some of my connection retries. It's important maybe if there's some maintenance that's being performed on the destination system, which you may or may not be aware of. You could put retransmits so that maybe there's a process that's running that just has to get put on hold until that system comes back online. So there's some things that you can tweak here within the basic FTP connection itself. So then we'll move to FTPS servers. There's no limit to how many of these connections you can define, by the way. You can create as many FTP resources as you want. Again, these are FTP devices that your system needs to connect to in order to run a business process. So we talk about FTPS resources now. You can see that we start to add some certificate. We start to add some security configuration. You can see here's my username and password. Here's the port that I configured, which is customizable by the recipient or the destination party, the server that you're connecting to. We have some connection settings similar to FTP, where we can govern if there's connection retries or anything along those lines that need to be incorporated, ports that need to be customized. Directory listing controls, same idea with the proxy, where you can have your FTPS resource use a proxy to get out to the outside world. Again, hiding your FTPS server, your Go Anywhere server, its IP address from the outside world. And then here is where I can define to my destination, am I connecting with explicit or implicit SSL at the security protocol that's used. And then I've got some controls here if I'm using plain text usernames and passwords, or if I'm encrypting usernames and passwords, and so on and so forth. And here is my certificate management. If I need to use a public key to connect to, a certificate to connect to an external, keys are associated with SFTP. If I need to use a certificate to connect to an external FTPS server, this is where I would define that. The partner would typically send that to you, and then you could import that into our KMS, which I'll get into shortly. So this is my FTP resource, and then you can see under your SSH servers within Go Anywhere, this is where all of my SFTP connections will be defined. So if I go into my Go Anywhere SFTP resource, you'll see here is my internal Go Anywhere IP address. This is where I can put my keys for my connection as well. Here's my username and password. Some similar configurations when we talk about connection retries and things along those lines. Again, I could define a proxy here, and then I've got my my key algorithms that I can use here when I make my connections to the destination SFTP server. So again, these are all of my connections that are associated with external parties, where GoAnywhere becomes a client and the external party is the server. So now we'll go through the listeners. I'm going to come into my service manager. So as you can see here, I've got 3 different listeners defined, one for FTP, one for FTPS, and one for SFTP. If I go into my FTP listener, so again, these are connections inbound to GoAnywhere. You can see I'm allowing explicit SSL here. I'm defining my keys, my cipher suites. I can configure basic settings, like for instance, do I want to automatically start the listener when GoAnywhere restarts? If I've got a fairly large, complex environment with multiple or maybe a half a dozen or maybe a dozen GoAnywhere servers, they're all part of a cluster. When it starts up, sometimes you want to let the operating system start up, let GoAnywhere start up, and then so we might have customers that come in here and they don't automatically start FTP. We want to make sure everything is running when they restart GoAnywhere, with the system reboots or something maintenance is performed. So you can control that. I can set upload restrictions here. I could put file filters. I can allow or deny certain types of files. From a security standpoint, these are pretty basic, these controls that can be put on for inbound connections. Recommendation is to use some sort of a content scanning engine. So we do have an ICAP gateway that does that. If files are renamed, they can circumvent this solution here. However, our content scanning engine can use file signatures to determine the actual the true file type as opposed to by file extension. So that can be controlled on the listener if you want. Here's my explicit SSL configuration, and then I've got my data connection as well, and my active and passive data connection, which is customizable. I wanted to go back to show you the port. So out of the box, port 21. And so this is essentially the basic configuration for FTP. This can be customized if I don't want people to connect to the default port. Some of our customers change the port to something non-standard, and then they give that to all of their trading partners. And so now when you're publishing FTP, you're not using the standard port 21. So those are the basics for FTP. As far as FTPS is concerned, very similar. However, now we're adding some additional layers of, let me start with FTPS. We're starting to add security. And as you can see now, we've got implicit SSL defined. So normally FTP unencrypted, there were some configurations in there, but normally FTP would not be encrypted. So FTPS, now we start to incorporate encryption. Similar settings with the file extension configurations, automatically starting the service or not, my data connection, and then my listener out of the box you could see is 990. Again, this is customizable, but now we start to see the introducing of a little more security over FTP. And usually that would be configured either for both the control and the data channel or just the data channel itself. And then here's my SFTP, which you'll see it's a little less on the configuration standpoint, same with the file extensions, but now I'm just setting port 22, which is also customizable, and then my host keys that I'm using in order to encrypt the session. So as we move from FTP to SFTP, you'll see that we incorporate some additional security controls around encryption. And here is the inbound configurations that are applied there. And so now I'm going to briefly go over our key management system, because this is where my keys and my certificates are going to be managed. Let me come to my encryption, my key management system. And so you can see here that I've got both certificates for my, among other things, my FTPS connections, and then I've got my SSH keys. So I've got all my key pairs defined here. I can create them, I can manage them, I can import them in here as well. So if I just come into my SSH keys, you'll see I've got my RSA keys for, I've got some web user configuration. So you can see the public and the private keys exist. I can export these, I can import them, I can manage them pretty much however I want. And now if I move over to my certificates, and I just look at any one of these certificates, let me just, you'll see that I've got, for instance, the signature algorithm, the organization it belongs to, the size, and so on and so forth. So this is all customizable when you create your certificates and your keys. You can define these settings on your own. So our key management system is a wrapper. It wraps certificates and keys so that they are not sitting on the flat file system. If you have a requirement to store them on the flat file system, you can certainly do that. You can import certificates and SSH and PGP keys and certificates. You could just import them, and when you import them, they'll just sit on your flat file system, and you can see the key store location here. So it's a little less secure when we talk about importing keys and certificates into a flat file system as opposed to a key management system or KMS. And so now let's just walk through some of the configuration. I have a couple of connections. If I go into my reporting, I go into my audit logs, and now I can see here, if I look at FTP, I've got connections that came in, I've got users authenticated, I've got disconnects, I've got connections. You can see my users are logging in, I'm transferring files. Every step along the way is logged inbound. And then, as you can see here, when files are actually uploaded, each one of these where you see the transfer complete, you see this little antivirus icon here. If I click that, it just basically shows me that the file was scanned. In this case, it was skipped because there was no virus identified. As you can see, it's a plain file. So now what I can do, if I come into my antivirus log, I have a couple of additional files here that I was testing, but you see there's a couple of, let me just scroll down here. I've got a couple of files that were actually rejected, credit card infractions and things along those lines, software and executables. So if I just take a look at one of this MSI file, which is an executable, where I perform my content analysis, I scroll all the way over to the left and I click my little magnifying glass, not to get too carried away. You'll see here, oops, sorry about that, I just clicked on the wrong file. Let me just find the file that was actually rejected. So we come down to this one. This one's a DLP infraction. If I click on this magnifying glass, you'll see here that it found that the file was an executable. It's notepad.exe, which was renamed to text. So that's my content and scanning engine. So now I'm going to come back to FTPS. So these are my inbound connections, people connecting to the listeners. I've got a similar configuration in the logs. You can see that I've got my connection established, my user logged in, the file transfers are complete. So I'm separating my FTP from my FTPS logs, but everything about the session is logged here. And then I've got my SFTP connections as well. So as you can see, similar concept. I've got connections coming in, I've got connections, I've got disconnects, I've got file scans taking place here. You can see the user that's signing in the user column. So they look very similar from a logging standpoint for the inbound listener. I'm going to show you projects here now where we can actually look at a little more detail about the connections that's coming in for SFTP. For instance, we can see like the key exchange that takes place. So before I do that, I just wanted to point out one thing, which I realized that I did not on the FTPS listener. I've got my port range, which is on my passive data connection. So this is you've got two parts. You've got the control channel and the data channel. The data channel has the data for FTPS. This is where you would define your port range. For instance, from like 30,000, I think, to 32,000 would be the default, something along those lines. So this is where you would define that port range that that people are using when FTPS sessions are created. So I think I skipped that part when I was going over that. So now I'm going to come into my workflows, because what you'll see here is I have the ability to beef up logging when people are connecting into Go Anywhere. Go Anywhere is providing a service. It's acting as the server to a client that connected. So as you can see here, I've got some files that I scanned, some uploads that took place, and I'm going to just go into some of these logs. And you can see here there's a red X. That was a file that got blocked. But I've beefed up some of the, oh, not that one was, let me come back and take a look at a different one. That was a 00. That one was skipped. I'm just gonna go through some of my other log files here. And so this one is a little bit better. You can see I've got my connections, and where did I miss? Oh, that was, excuse me, I was looking at the wrong projects. I had some failures that I was working on something else here. So I'm going to look at my Go Anywhere SFTP, and then I've got my FTP. So the first, for the SFTP, if I look at this log file, that's what I was after. So you can see the key exchange is logged. If you have the debug logging get set within your project, and that funnels down through all of your tasks, or you can set it on the task. You can see when an SFTP session is made, you can see that the key exchange takes place, and all of that stuff you can pump into your log file. So you can see here that a person connected via SFTP, username and password was provided, this file was uploaded. The important part here is that you're getting some details about the key exchange. And you can see all of that information is logged right here in this area. You can see the SSH session being established here, and you can see I've got an SFTP tasks that I'm executing. So I'm essentially connecting to an external now. I'm the client, and I'm just logging everything about my connection. And then, as you can see, if I look at my test here, this is actually my FTPS connection. You can see here that although I've got some logging available with the connection, I can't see anything about the certificate exchange, right? Because the logging is a little more robust in SFTP, and you may find that when you're kind of comparing feature functionality between FTPS as well as SFTP. With SFTP, you can see that we can log a little more detail about the key exchange, whereas with SFTP and certificates, we can't log any of that. So that's a little bit of an advantage for using SFTP as well. So now if I go into my SFTP project, what you can see here is I'm just essentially turning Go Anywhere into a client. I have a workflow. Maybe I need to sweep the network for a file or parse something inside of a SQL database where I have to query for some data, return it, create a flat file with it under my data translation. And then what I need to do is I need to take that file and I need to transfer that file via SFTP and put it somewhere at a remote destination. And so as you can see in my SFTP connection, which it is here, so this is linked to the resource that I created where I have the information about establishing a session, making Go Anywhere act as a client to connect to a remote SFTP server. And so now I define that resource. I set my log label to debug. The reason why I'm doing this again is so that I can get more information out about the key exchange that took place, which I just demonstrated. If I don't do that and I set this to normal on the task or within the project, as you can see here, then what winds up happening is I just put basic information about the session being established and no information about the key exchange. So there's your project-based configuration. That's taking Go Anywhere, turning it into from a client into a server. Now, so I've kind of walked through the configuration both outbound as well as inbound, walked through the certificate and key management to some extent, work through some project logic for outbound configurations. It could be for inbound as well. If sessions are made inbound, you could also link that to a trigger, for instance. And I've also worked through some of the logging and the content scanning as well. One other thing I wanted to point out has to do with automatic IP blocklisting or blacklisting. Essentially, this is enabled out of the box. You can customize it. You can see here that I've got my internal IP address that I try to make a brute force attack against to sign in to Go Anywhere, trying to transfer data when I wasn't authorized. So if I click on edit and I have all this enabled, I've got a bunch of usernames here. So these are best practices. You can see that I've got things like root, admin, guest, usernames that start with numbers and things along those lines. And what I do is I'm essentially just banning repeated connection attempts to try to mitigate a bad actor from creating sessions and signing into your environment when they're not really authorized. And so this is customizable, enabled by default. Some of these settings are enabled by default, like for instance, the automatic blacklist. So that list will build over time. You can leave them permanently blacklisted. And so that's pretty much it from a automatic blacklist standpoint. As far as one other thing I wanted to go through is not necessarily just applying to resources, but connections that are coming in and out of Go Anywhere. Go Anywhere supports clustering. In addition, you could put load balancers for outbound or inbound. So if you're allocated 5 IP addresses for an FTPS or an SFTP or an FTP remote listener, so again, Go Anywhere acts as the client to a remote server, you could either create all of those connections. Now what you would need to do is you would need to build some form of logic into a project where you could say, you could use if condition statements to work through each of those if, for instance, one of those devices is offline. Or you can consider incorporating load balancing devices, especially for inbound, if you've got multiple environments or multiple IP addresses and you want to load balance across all of those ports. When you cluster Go Anywhere and you allocate IP addresses to the front end, Go Anywhere can help you with that, but it's always recommended to consider a load balancer as well. So I think that's it for the demo. I covered all of the areas that I wanted to go through. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to today's session, to watch today's session, and I'm going to kick this back over to Darian to see maybe if we have any questions.
Scott, we do have a few questions that have come in. So the first one I've got for you is, in terms of speed for FTPS and SFTP, which one would you recommend?
Yep, so we've got a couple of different tests that we've run for FTPS. We've identified that it is a little bit quicker in the stress test that we run. We can share those results as well if any of you like to see them. We've seen FTPS is a little bit quicker, but SFTP, there have been some changes that have been made on the encryption front that might allow for the SFTP file transfer process to be sped up a little bit. Those changes are not incorporated yet, but I would expect to see them sometime in the near future. And once those changes are made, we might see SFTP kind of catch up to FTPS from a performance standpoint. But at the present time, if performance is a concern, FTPS is the recommended approach.
Great, thanks, Scott. Yeah, and the next question I'm seeing is, out of the 3 protocols we went through today, what would you say is the most common protocol used?
The most common probably is SFTP because it's the newest. It's simple to configure, simple to install. Single port is used, incorporates pretty much a little bit of everything from an ease of use to security standpoint, it's a little bit easier. You don't have the their certificate management that's associated with it, although you still have your SSH keys, and it's a single port. And so it's probably the most common because it's the newest, and people have started to move towards SFTP. However, FTP and FTPS are still widely used, but just to answer that specific question, probably SFTP.
Great, awesome, thank you. It looks like we've got time for maybe one more question. So let's grab this one. In terms of 3DES, is that considered weak nowadays?
So it's not necessarily that it's weak. It has been phased out by newer encryption algorithms such as AES 256. Legacy platforms are still using 3DES, so we still support it. And so most of the newer algorithms have been shifted over to AES 256. But to answer your question, I guess it is being phased out to some extent, but we still fully support it. And so that's, hopefully I've answered that question.
Yeah, I think that works great. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Scott, for presenting for us. Please don't forget to fill out the survey following this webinar so that we can provide you with more webinars on topics you'd like to hear about. You'll also be able to submit any questions we were not able to answer during today's webinar. And as always, please feel free to reach out if you need anything. And thank you, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.